The Nile River, home to civilization for nearly 7,000 years. With its nourishing waters, it has remained the lifeline of the Egyptian people since the very birth of agriculture. Today its delta is still the home of 90% of the country's population, who rely on its waters for their very survival. But over 3,000 years ago, this peaceful delta was the site of an armed conflict nearly unprecedented in scale. It pitted the forces of the new kingdom of Egypt against a foe that had reduced the nations of the eastern Mediterranean to ash. Behind them lay the ruined capitals of Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and Palestine. They left no records of their own, and our knowledge of them today is derived entirely from the records of their opponents. In surviving inscriptions, they are named adversary, a blight upon civilization itself. From whence they came, we do not know, for their kingdom was the sea itself, from which they emerged to challenge the might of the Egyptian empire. Their attack was doomed to failure, but the force of their blow plunged Egypt into disorder and decay. Soon it would join the other fallen nations of the East, as the light of civilization went out for centuries to come. How did it happen? When? And most importantly of all, who or what was behind it? Was it the fault of the mysterious sea peoples, or were other factors behind the demise of the Bronze Age nations of the Eastern Mediterranean? Most of these questions are still being debated in one fashion or another, but the details we already know are beyond tantalizing. Alongside centuries-old theories of warfare and foreign invasions, new theories of famine, civil unrest, and natural disaster are slowly creeping into the picture. The result was a saga, both dramatic and mundane, and one that holds eerie parallels to our own civilization in the 21st century. But before we can begin to understand the reasons behind the collapse, we have to familiarise ourselves with what the world of the late Bronze Age would have looked like. Already more than a millennium old, it was a world of startling complexity, covered in feuding nation-states, and containing more than one great power. To the west sat Greece, home to the great power centres of the Mycenaean culture. The east held Assyria, hegemon of Mesopotamia, and holder of the ancient cities of Akkad, Sumer, and Babylon. And in the middle, separated by a patchwork of vassals that stretched through modern Palestine and Syria, sat the opposing forces of the Hittite Empire and the Egyptian New Kingdom. Direct conflict between the two had long since passed, but still they jockeyed for power over the great trade routes of the East, from which flowed the precious tin and copper on which all kingdoms relied for survival. At first glance, the world of the 13th century BC seems a stable one, with its key players firmly entrenched in their respective homelands. But within the span of the next century, each of these nations would undergo a series of catastrophic setbacks. The lucky ones would see themselves reduced to a shadow of their former selves, whilst others would be torn asunder, surviving only as myths, passed down by word of mouth through the dark ages that succeeded them. The sources of the cataclysms are complex, and at the moment we have only a rough understanding of each of these factors. Even so, what is known gives us a tantalising glimpse at how even the most powerful of nations can find themselves knocked off course by events beyond their control. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. If we want to understand exactly how an established order can collapse so quickly, we will first have to travel back into the history of each of its nations. And where better to start our journey than with the very first civilization to fall victim to the collapse. Many of us know at least a little of ancient Greece, of its great philosophers and scientists, of the rivalry between Sparta and Athens, and the gathering power of Macedonia to the north. But what we find, looking back at the archaic Greek world of 1500 BC, is something both familiar and alien to its classical successor. For at least since the Middle Bronze Age, Greece had been a nation of agrarian villagers, ruled over by a patchwork of palatial centres. From the decipherment of their written language, known now as Linear B, we can tell that they did indeed speak a version of Greek, and that the gods of classical Greece were already being worshipped within their halls. These palatial kingdoms were likely modelled on that of the Minoans at Crete, themselves one of the dominant merchant powers within the Mediterranean, and whose distinctive clothing and textiles have been found as far away as Mesopotamia. From each one, the local ruler, known as the Anax or the Basileus, would have sought to extend his power, and to acquire exotic goods through a complex hierarchy of administration and trade. Some of these rulers were more powerful than others, but the largest by far was Mycenae, whose power extended over an area nearly 3 times that of its nearest rival. Then, around the middle of the 15th century BC, disaster struck in Crete. Debate still rages on its exact nature. It may have been an earthquake, much like the one that rocked Minoan civilization around 1700 BC. A volcanic eruption at Thera has also been suggested as the culprit, though radiocarbon dating now seems to discredit this theory. Whatever the source, it was enough to leave the Minoan palaces in disarray. Mycenae was quick to take advantage, and soon the great palaces of Knossos, Phaistos, and many others were overrun by mainland Greeks. With this, the millennia-old Minoan civilization came to an end, and Mycenaeans quickly took their place as one of the dominant trading nations in the eastern Mediterranean. From there, they would expand into the Aegean, establishing settlements within the Cyclades and on the western coast of Anatolia. But this unchecked growth could only last so long, and from the 14th century onwards they seem to have come into conflict with a number of western Anatolian cities. The name of one in particular is still known today, kept alive by a legendary war it supposedly fought with the Bronze Age Greeks. The Hittites may have called it Walusia, whilst their opponents knew it as Ilium, but it is by its other name that it is most commonly known today: Troy. Alas, the story of the Bronze Age collapse is not yet that of the Trojan War. Instead, at this time, Western Anatolia was busy rebelling against the region's emerging superpower. Founded somewhere between the early 17th and 16th century BC, the Hittites were not the first people to rule in Anatolia, but they were by far the most successful. Emerging from the city of Hattusa, under their first known king, Hattusili I, they expanded across the peninsula, often spreading their influence at the point of a sword. Their wars likely had a simple objective. Much as modern civilization relies on the 2 major resources of oil and gas, so too did life over 3 millennia ago rely on 2 hard-to-find metals. Their function was simple, for together they could be used to craft the bronze on which rulers of the time relied to outfit their armies. The first of these Copper was one the Hittites either had in abundance or received from the copper mines of their neighbours in southeast Anatolia. The second, tin, was harder to come by. Two sources of it have been suggested in the ancient world, from mines far to the east in modern Afghanistan, or from others further west in the Balkans of Europe. Securing access to this precious metal would require Hittite control over the major trade routes of Anatolia and Syria, and over the next century they set out to accomplish just that. To the south, they conquered lands around Cilicia, gaining them access to the Mediterranean. In the east, they clashed with Aleppo, winning a series of victories under Hattusili's grandson Musuli that gained them access to the lucrative trade of the Euphrates. To the west, things also went in their favour. There the Hittites encountered resistance by a group known as the Azawa countries, centred in western Anatolia. They are best remembered today for the likely presence of Wilusha, or Troy, within their ranks, though it seems to be more frequently an ally than an enemy of the Hittites. Either way, it makes little difference. Both Wilusha and Azawa were conquered by the Hittites, though they would rebel many times in the centuries to come. By the late 16th century, the Hittites would campaign as far afield as Mesopotamia, where Musuli sacked the ancient city of Babylon and carted off images of its chief deities. And then, within only a short time, these conquests came undone. Musuli was murdered shortly after returning from Babylon, dying at the hands of his own brother-in-law. Over the next century, the extent of Hittite rule would fluctuate, at times stretching into Syria and Azawa, before collapsing back into their heartlands around central Anatolia. After the conquest of Aleppo by the Egyptians in the mid-15th century, the Hittites saw fit to pay tribute to Pharaoh Thutmose III. Soon after, their fortunes would revive again under King Tudhalius I, which saw them expand into the east, defeating Aleppo and a newer state, Mitanni. To the west, they advanced again, this time defeating a new confederation known as Asuwa. And for the first time, a nation known as Ahiawa is recorded as active in western Anatolia, where they twice attacked Hittite vassals in Azawa. The identity of Ahiawa remains controversial even today, but more recent evidence points the finger across the Aegean to the halls of Mycenae itself. But this success was all temporary. With Tudhaliya's death, his kingdom collapsed, with enemies invading it from both the north and the east. From the north, the people of the Kaska lands invaded the Hittite heartlands themselves, burning Hattusa itself to the ground. Despite these setbacks, the Hittite kingdom persisted until the 14th century BC, when it began a remarkable recovery. And it is to one king in particular that this recovery can be largely attributed. His name was Suppiluliuma. He came to the throne in the early 14th century BC, overthrowing his brother in the process, and from there on out he set about forging his kingdom into an empire. Taking advantage of turmoil to the south, he conquered Aleppo, regaining access to vital seagoing trade. After that, he captured the capital of Mitanni and encouraged Egyptian vassals to rebel throughout Syria. In the west, he had less success, but he was still able to stretch Hittite influence further into Azawa than any of his immediate predecessors. Such was the pinnacle of his power that the widow of the Egyptian pharaoh, likely Tutankhamun, wrote to him to ask him to send her one of his sons so that he might marry her and rule over Egypt. A son was duly sent, but the journey would result in his demise. Despite this setback, by his own death, Suppiluliuma had made his kingdom one of the most preeminent within the Mediterranean. If only his immediate successors had been so lucky. Many of them were doomed to spend much of their early reigns stamping out revolts in both the east and the west. Even with these rebellions quelled, the Hittites still found powerful rivals circling their borders. To the north, they again came into conflict with the Kaska peoples, who once more sacked Hattusa. Still, the Hittites endured, and their conflict with another nation to the south would cement their imperial status for a century to come. That rival was a powerful one indeed. For more than 15 centuries, Egypt had been one of the world's preeminent powers. By the time of the 15th century BC, its new kingdom was flourishing under the leadership of the 18th dynasty. Its ships plied the seas of the eastern Mediterranean, where it traded with the Minoans for clothing and weapons, with the people of the Sinai for copper and turquoise, and even as far as Azua and further south in the land of Punt. After Minoan civilization collapsed, Mycenaean trade took their place, who the Egyptians referred to as Danaja. Throughout the remainder of the century, the new kingdom would expand, conquering Nubia, Canaan, and Syria, with Pharaoh Thutmose III crossing the Euphrates to campaign against Mitanni. But by the 14th century BC, its power would be weakened by the Aten affair, when the pharaoh of the time, Amenhotep IV, sought to change the state religion to one of a more monotheistic direction. Renaming himself Akhenaten, he introduced a system of worship centered around the sun disk, or the Aten. This deity was cast as the true ruler of Egypt, with the pharaoh as his temporal equivalent on earth. Akhenaten likely made the move to burnish his own power, and to weaken that of the priest classes of Egypt. The result he achieved was rebellions, both in Nubia and Syria. The Hittites were all too quick to take advantage. Upon his death, Aten worship was abandoned by his son and successor, Tutankhamun, along with a new city he built on the east bank of the Nile. Tutankhamun did not reign for long. With the boy pharaoh's own demise, the 18th dynasty slowly came to an end, with a series of short-lived successors paving the way for the 19th dynasty. Under this new leadership, the Egyptians would soon revive their status as hegemon of the Mediterranean. Under Seti I, they took control of Egypt's vast mineral wealth, including copper and tin in the Sinai, and gold in Nubia. Slowly, Seti's forces moved back into Canaan and Syria, wresting the city of Kadesh from the Hittites, which he and his son Ramses entered in triumph. But the occupation didn't last. The Hittites regrouped, and they soon took back the city and much of northern Syria. From then on, an uneasy peace descended. The Hittites kept control of the city, while Seti returned to Egypt to deal with rebellion in Nubia. But the tensions between the two sides couldn't remain bottled up forever. In the 4th year of the reign of Seti's successor, Ramses II, they finally boiled over. The result was one of the most well-documented battles of the ancient world, the Battle of Kadesh. The battle took place outside the gates of the city. Here, Hittite scouts supposedly leaked a false position to their opponents, lulling them into an ambush. Our main source for the events of the battle itself come from Egyptian inscriptions, which claim that over 50,000 men were deployed between the two forces, along with over 5,000 chariots, the most ever deployed in a single battle. Its exact outcome was uncertain. The Egyptian inscriptions report a victory for their side, but their claims were mocked in a letter to Ramses himself by the later Hittite king Hattusilis III. Ultimately, neither side seems to have suffered a clear defeat. The Hittites withdrew, but the Egyptians failed to take the city. The two sides would jostle for advantage for the better part of the next 2 decades, until a succession war amongst the Hittites compelled them to make terms. The Silver Treaty was finally signed in year 21 of Ramses' reign, and it may even have been sealed with a form of royal marriage. Peace with Egypt came at a fortuitous time for the Hittites. To the east, a new power was rising amongst the ancient cities of Mesopotamia. Existing perhaps as early as the 25th century BC, Assyria had been the seat of its own empire in the late 3rd millennium BC, and for more than 1,000 years it had remained a strong regional power. All this would change with the emergence of Mitanni in the 16th and 15th centuries BC, after which Assyrian power began a slow decline. In the mid-15th century BC, Assur itself was sacked, and the nation was reduced to a Mitannian vassal. This state of affairs remained until the mid-14th century, when unrest amongst a pro-Assyrian faction within the Mitanni royal court allowed King Erid-Adad to throw off their influence once and for all. His son, Ashur-uballit, was even able to annex Mitannian territory, taking advantage of their former overlord's weakness after Suppiluliuma and the Hittites crushed their power west of the Euphrates. Around the same time, Ashur sent a letter to Akhenaten in Egypt, announcing himself and his kingdom as the equals of Mitanni, and marking the beginning of the Middle Assyrian Kingdom. The ambitions of Ashur and his successors would lead them to a status far beyond that of Mitanni. Over the next century, they slowly expanded their borders, both at the expense of Mitanni to the west and Babylon to the east. By the 14th century BC, Ashur's son and successor, Enlil-nirari, would name himself as Sharu-Rabi, or Great King, in his letters to the Hittite ruler. His great-grandson, Shalmaneser I, would go one further, defeating a combined force of Hittites, Mitannians, and their allies in the middle of the 13th century BC. Under his predecessors, Assyria had already expanded to the edges of the Hittite domain, but now Shalmaneser took hold of Hittite-ruled territories in the west, incorporating what remained of Mitanni into his kingdom. Not finished, he dealt his enemies a further blow, taking control of the copper mines at Isuwa, on which the Hittites relied so heavily to make their precious bronze. Hittite woes were far from over. For the rest of the century, Assyria continued to press them, expanding their lands westward into Syria. The Hittites responded as best they could, fomenting a marriage alliance with Amurru in coastal Syria, with the overall aim of restricting Assyrian access to Mediterranean trade. Under King Tudhalius IV, they would also invade Cyprus, known for its rich copper supplies. Alas, their efforts came to naught. In 1237 BC, the Assyrians again defeated them at the Battle of Niria, further weakening Hittite influence within the region. Led now by Shalmaneser's son, Tukulti-Ninurta, the Assyrians turned their gaze eastward, finally placing their own king on the throne of Babylon. After this, Tukulti would assume the ancient title of the Akkadian Empire, naming himself king of both Sumer and Akkad. Eventually, he would go even further, assuming a title made famous by the Persian kings of more than half a millennium later. King of Kings. So here at last, around the end of the 13th century BC, we find ourselves on the edge of a precipice. In the space of the next half-century, almost all the powers that we have chronicled here would fall into ruin. For much of human history, the reasons behind this collapse would remain unclear. Then, around the end of the 19th century, a theory was put forward, based on a series of reliefs found at the mortuary temple of the 20th dynasty pharaoh Ramses III. Here, intricate scenes outline a battle that took place in the early 12th century BC between the forces of Ramses and a mysterious seafaring confederation. If we are to take the inscriptions at face value, then these sea peoples were responsible for the destruction of Mycenae, of Arzawa and the Hittite Empire, of Cyprus and of city-states stretching throughout Syria and Canaan. It took them remarkably little time, as they appeared on the world scene only 2 decades prior. Then, in the year 1177 BC, they appeared on the eastern shores of Egypt. In the inscriptions at Medinet Habu, they are depicted as a diverse group, wearing different forms of dress and speaking many languages. From here, we also learn their names, the Sherden and the Shekelesh, the Peleset and the Denyen, the Tajeka and the Weshesh. It seemed they intended to settle in Egypt, for with them they brought their families in ox-drawn carts. They would clash twice with the Egyptians, first on land, then on the waters of the Nile itself. According to the inscriptions, their invasion was a failure, as Ramses defeated them at the Battle of the Delta. Thousands of the intruders were killed or captured, and Ramses was forced to settle his prisoners in camps along the Nile. The Sea People threat was at last defeated, all through the might of the Egyptian pharaoh. The few survivors of the Sea Peoples fled eastwards, settling down amongst the rubble of Syria and Canaan, becoming the forefathers of the biblical Philistines. Were these invaders truly responsible for the Bronze Age collapse? Indeed, for much of the 20th century, the theory of the Sea Peoples was accepted as the driving force behind much of the devastation seen throughout the eastern Mediterranean at this time. But in recent decades, scholars have become more sceptical of this theory, and indeed it raises many problems when considering the archaeological evidence we now have at our disposal. To demonstrate this, let's take a look at how the collapse affected each nation in turn. We start again with Mycenaean Greece. Here it is universally accepted that the sites of Mycenae, Tiryns, Mydia and Pylos were all violently destroyed somewhere between the late 13th and early 12th century BC. Other sites, such as the Argolid or at Corinthia, seem to have been abandoned entirely. Many of these sites also show signs of mass fortification in the decades prior to their final destruction, hinting that perhaps they knew that trouble lay on the horizon. The most tantalising piece of evidence comes from Pylos, where a Linear B tablet has been found, indicating that in the palace's final years, its rulers placed watchers on the sea. Shortly after this, Pylos was burned, with the conflagration being hot enough to melt both the walls of its palace and the gold of its fine ornaments. On face value, these destructions fit well with the Sea People's theory, but at many sites, the source of this violence is now disputed. In some cases, such as Tiryns, the destruction was more likely the fault of an earthquake than that of violent invasion. Mycenae shows ample evidence of a cataclysmic fire, but there is no evidence of the site being depopulated, nor are there any of the telltale signs of arrowheads or other weaponry we might expect to see a conquering army leave behind. sites like Pylos do leave open the possibility of raiders from the sea, but even then, there are other culprits to consider. The Greeks of the classical era would place the blame squarely at the feet of another group, the Dorians, who supposedly migrated into Greece from lands further to the north. The tradition of their migrations was well established in the world of the 5th century BC, with individual city-states identifying with either Dorian or Ionian ethnicities. But when compared with modern evidence, the tale of these migrations rings false. New settlements do appear throughout Greece in the centuries after the collapse, but there is no sign of mass depopulation, or of an influx of new migrants. Pottery styles, though cruder, still retain many of the shapes of the Mycenaean age, and the disappearance of Linear B writing can be explained by the destruction of the palace centres from which scribes would have operated. In fact, the great Dorian centres of Sparta and Corinth show no obvious signs of habitation until long after the collapse. Instead, the presence of these new linguistic groups might be better explained by the removal of the existing palace elites, which would have allowed regional dialects to come to the fore. All this taken together, it seems unlikely that the Sea Peoples were behind the destructions in Greece. So what about the rest? Let us turn our attention to Anatolia, where the Hittites were struggling to retain their empire. Here we again see many cities destroyed around the beginning of the 12th century BC. In western Anatolia, there are clear signs of destruction at Troy, with a destruction layer being datable to around 1180 BC. Hattusa itself was burned somewhere around 1200 BC, after which time it was abandoned along with many other central Anatolian sites. With their destruction, the Hittite Empire came to an end, never to rise again. But were the Sea Peoples behind their demise? If we discount Troy, there is no evidence of widespread destruction in western Anatolia, the coasts of which the Sea Peoples may have sailed past on their route to Syria and Egypt. Here the majority of the cities simply seem to have been abandoned, with little to no signs of violence. And if we stop to consider the destruction in central Anatolia, the picture becomes even less clear. Firstly, if the Sea Peoples were indeed seafarers by nature, then what were they doing here, high in the mountains and valleys of central Anatolia? And how then would they have had the siege capabilities to overcome the fortifications of Hattusa? For many archaeologists, the answer is simple. They didn't. Instead, the finger of suspicion points elsewhere, to the many enemies the Hittites had been slowly collecting over the previous centuries. The leading candidates are the Casca peoples, who, as we remember, sacked Hattusa only 100 years prior. But how was it that the Hittites found themselves so vulnerable to collapse? Their heartlands had been invaded many times in the centuries before, yet this time their kingdom seems to have simply collapsed into oblivion. To explain this, we must again return to the theory of the Sea Peoples and their activities in the southern reaches of the empire. That's because around 1225 BC, a wave of destruction rolled across Hittite territories in Cyprus and Syria. Cypriot settlements at sites such as Enkomi, Kition and Cinder were raided and destroyed in quick succession, whilst in North Syria we see the destruction of cities such as Kadesh, Alaka and Ugarit. From the ruins of the latter, a tablet has been unearthed, written just before the city's final destruction. Its text is fragmentary, but what is legible carries a chilling plea from the ruler of Ugarit, calling out to a Hittite king whose help was never to arrive. "My father, Behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it, the 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. Shortly thereafter, the city was destroyed. Here then, we seem at last to have some evidence for the Sea People's activities. But whilst sea-borne raiders certainly seem tied to some of the destructions seen in Syria, the Sea Peoples aren't the only candidates. In fact, the Ugarit tablet never mentions them by name, and the only other mention attributed to them comes from the site of Emar in inland Syria. Destroyed around the same time as Ugarit, tablets found there, written in Akkadian, refer to various hordes, but again do not refer to the Sea Peoples by name. There are also difficulties in squaring the geography and the dates of many of these destructions with the narrative laid out in the inscriptions at Egypt. Radiocarbon dating now places the destruction of many of these sites around 1190 BC. So if the Sea Peoples were behind the destructions in Syria, then why did it take them another decade to reach Egypt? The destructions in Cyprus also pose problems for the Sea Peoples theory. Here the destructions were not followed by an imposition of any new culture. Instead, we see the slow emergence of a new synthesis of Cypriot, Aegean and Levantine social identities, and one that was to prosper in the century ahead. Whatever the source of these destructions, they were catastrophic for the Hittites. The loss of Cyprus also meant the loss of their precious copper reserves, and destructions in Syria and southern Anatolia may have severed their access to the trade of the Mediterranean. In the northwest, Azzoa also falls eerily silent, perhaps robbing the Hittites of access to their vital tin routes. These developments came at the worst possible time, as it is clear from Hittite correspondence that central Anatolia was also undergoing a devastating famine, with grain having to be imported from vassals in northern Syria and even as far afield as Egypt. With these lifelines severed, the Hittites were simply torn apart by a combination of war and hunger. So here it seems we might very well have found a kernel of truth behind the idea of the Sea Peoples, if we keep our interpretation broad. Sea Peoples or not, the activity of marauders displaced from elsewhere in the Mediterranean could well have cut the vital links that held the Hittite Empire together. One might think that these events would also have been a gift to the Hittites' rivals in Egypt and Assyria, who would have been free to snap up former Hittite vassals in Anatolia and Syria. But at the time, both were far too busy with their own set of problems, which were substantial enough to deny their advance into the former Hittite world for the foreseeable future. To the east, Assyria seems to have avoided the brunt of the collapse seen around the Mediterranean, and what destruction has been found is unlikely to be connected to the Sea Peoples. Instead, this violence seems to stem from Assyrian conflicts with the state of Elam in the western reaches of modern Iran, along with the activities of a temporarily resurgent Babylonia under Nebuchadnezzar I. The Assyrians would eventually take over many of the former Hittite lands in Syria, but around the middle of the 11th century BC, they also seem to have gone into a decline. Over the next century, much of their empire was slowly lost, but Assyria and its core territories remained a powerful player in Mesopotamian politics. But by the late 10th century BC, its fortunes would turn again, and over the next 300 years, it expanded until it formed the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the largest state the world had yet known. So in the long term, the the Bronze Age collapse seems to have worked out in the Assyrians' favour. But what about the Hittites' other rivals, the Egyptians, who around the same time were supposedly facing the Sea Peoples on the Nile Delta? Surely victory there would have left them with ample opportunities to push into former Hittite lands. Indeed, if we follow the inscriptions of Ramses III, the period after the Sea Peoples' invasion seems to have been one of continuity and stability in Egypt, during which expansion could have been a real possibility. But we now know that many of the monuments constructed by Ramses III act to mask larger problems in Egypt. It seems that as big a threat as the Sea Peoples posed, Egypt was also dealing with another threat, as Libyan tribes were mounting frequent raids into the west of the country. The economic realities of dealing with these threats, along with a famine that seems to have struck Egypt in the later years of his reign, raised the price of grain, and in the process weakened the centralised nature of the state. Widespread corruption also forced Ramses into reorganising Egypt's priesthood, and it was during this process that he made a pivotal decision, one that in the long term would spell doom for his dynasty. Over the course of this restructuring, he made a series of huge land grants, particularly to the high priests of Amun in Thebes. Soon, almost a third of Egypt's arable land was within their grasp, and this rival economic centre slowly contributed to the collapse of Ramses' authority. Ultimately, it would prove his undoing, as his waning power led to a conspiracy against him from within his own harem. The results of this plot can still be seen on his mummy today, where a deep knife wound mars his throat. Ramses III was the last effective ruler of the 20th dynasty. After his death, Egypt's Syrian and Palestinian provinces broke up, and Egypt itself would retreat ever inwards. Soon after, they lost access to the gold mines of Nubia, on which they relied to pay their armies and decorate their tombs. Slowly, the country fragmented, descending into the Third Intermediate Period. Centralised rule would not return for the better part of 400 years. With that, the events of the Late Bronze Age collapse were over. Beyond them lay a Dark Age, during which mass migration would change the shape of the Mediterranean. The Philistines settled down in the Levant, where the Phoenicians would also emerge from the 12th century BC onwards. In Syria and Anatolia, various Neo-Hittite kingdoms would cling on, whilst Lydia slowly expanded to cover most of Asia Minor. And of activities in Greece, we know comparatively little. Writing would not reappear there until the 8th century BC, and by then the events of the collapse had been heavily edited by generations of oral retellings, transforming them into the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So who really were the Sea Peoples? We've seen plentiful evidence of destruction and raids throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But can we say for certain that they were behind them? Alas, we lack the evidence to definitively tie the peoples that appear in the reliefs at Medinet Habu to the destructions that lie behind the Bronze Age collapse. And as with much of the rest of Ramses III's reign, there may be good reasons to doubt the veracity of the inscriptions themselves. In his statues and monuments, Ramses seems to go out of his way to compare himself to his illustrious predecessors. In particular, he seeks to ape the golden age of the reigns of both Ramses II and his son Meneptah, and may well have embellished his own accomplishments to match. The case of the Sea Peoples was a prime candidate for this embellishment, for we now know that there was in fact another, earlier Sea Peoples invasion, which the Egyptians again repulsed at a battle near the Nile Delta. This invasion, taking place during the reign of Meneptah, happened around 1207 BC, when Ramses himself would have been a boy. In Meneptah's narrative, detailed in the Great Karnak inscription, his foes are 5, with the Ekwesh, the Luka, and the Teresh taking their places alongside the Sherden and the Shekalesh, all of whom fought alongside a large force of Libyan raiders. In comparison, Ramses' account has only the latter two in common, with his foes numbering either 6 or 7 nations. As mentioned before, one of these, the Peliset, have since been identified with the biblical Philistines, but for the other 4, identifications are far from certain. Associations have been claimed between the Denyen and the Teresh with Homeric Greece and Troy, whilst the origins of the others, the Tjeka and the Weshes, still remain uncertain. Moreover, in Meneptah's account, only the Sherden, the Shekalesh and the Ekwesh are named as sea peoples, whilst the others are simply northerners coming from all lands. Ramses' account also names the Sherden as of the sea, but not the Shekalesh, with the Weshesh and the Teresh taking their place. Complicating matters, the Sherden seem to have been well known before the other sea peoples, having been named as seaborne marauders from as early as the 14th century BC. Ramses II even records repulsing one of their raids himself on the Nile Delta in the 2nd year of his reign, after which many of their number were incorporated into the Egyptian army. There are even credible accounts of the Sherden being reported as fighting at the Battle of Kadesh. These inconsistencies between the various accounts make it somewhat rash to label the Battle of the Delta an outright fraud. However, it is plausible that the conflict may have been lesser in scale than claimed by Ramses himself, particularly as the other problems of his reign would have been more than enough to explain Egypt's decline. But the problems elsewhere in the Mediterranean are less easily explained. We must ask ourselves if the sea peoples weren't the cataclysmic force behind the Bronze Age collapse, then what was? Many theories have come and gone over the decades, and recently many archaeologists have gravitated towards theories of drought and climate change. As mentioned earlier, a major drought was certainly raging in Anatolia around the time of the Hittites' destruction, and pollen analysis from Cyprus now seems to indicate that conditions there were much drier than normal around the time of the collapse. Sediment analysis at sites across the Mediterranean also seem to confirm the idea of a general drought in the late 13th century BC, which in turn could explain the appearance of new groups of raiders and refugees. Drought might also explain the apparent abandonment of settlements throughout western Anatolia, or the isolated violence at cities such as Tel Hazor at Canaan, or Mycenae itself in Greece. Here scholars have theorised that the destructions may be the result of peasant rebellions, as in both places powerless areas associated with grain storage seem to have taken the brunt of the damage. Climate change certainly seems a compelling factor, but there are sites at which other elements seem to have been at work. Some display clear signs of generalised destruction, whilst others have clear evidence of arrowheads and weaponry within their destruction layers. In the case of the former, many archaeologists have now proposed that earthquakes were the cause of much of the devastation. Indeed, there are examples of misaligned walls and falling masonry to be found all over the Mediterranean, with damage being visible at cities such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Mydia, Pylos, Troy, Hattusa, Ugarit, Megiddo, and many others. In fact, it now seems that the period of the Bronze Age collapse was correlated with an unusually large amount of seismic activity within the Mediterranean, with the rate of earthquakes only diminishing further into the 12th century BC. These earthquakes would have inflicted severe damage on the cities and palaces of the Bronze Age world. But this destruction doesn't seem to stretch quite far enough to explain the collapse itself. In most of the cities listed, the damage was swiftly patched, and only a few, such as Tiryns in Greece and Tel Hazor in Canaan, seem to have been abandoned immediately thereafter. Certainly, the damage could have made sites more vulnerable to invasion, but in most cases, the final destructions happen years or decades later, long after the worst of the damage would have been repaired. As we conclude our journey through the events of the Late Bronze Age collapse, it seems that multiple factors lie behind its events. Earthquakes, invasions, climate change, and trade route collapse. From the evidence available to us, it seems that no one of these is solely responsible, and that more and more the events of the collapse can only be explained by a combination of them all. Any guess at an exact timeline remains speculative, but it is not unreasonable to state that the true story of the collapse may have looked a little like this. Late in the 13th century BC, an extended wave of drought rolls across the Bronze Age Mediterranean, leading to crop failure and starvation, which in turn sparked local uprisings. Earthquake damage only hastened this turmoil, and this in turn made cities more attractive targets to migrating bands of raiders. Some of these peoples may well have banded together, as did the Sea Peoples, after which they would have journeyed southward in search of new lands to settle. In the wake of their destruction, many sites were abandoned entirely, only being repopulated later by peoples carrying new languages and cultures. This unrest, along with increased piracy throughout the Mediterranean, would have collapsed the trade networks on which the kingdoms of the time relied. One by one, the major powers fell, and much of the civilized world vanished into a dark age. Some international trade would have continued, but less and less of it came within the control of the former centralized states. Over the next few centuries, literacy also declines, and new kingdoms are founded in mythical circumstances throughout Greece and Anatolia. Eventually, a new world would emerge, one of Athenians and Spartans, of Assyrians and Babylonians, and in the distant future lies the mighty Persian Empire of Cyrus the Great. And with them emerges a new metal, one that would soon take the place of bronze as the arbiter of empires. The Iron Age had begun.